Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. Welcome to our plenary training and discussion session, the round table entitled People, Culture and Community Sources. It says in the blurb here, treating people as a field is increasingly vital for established disciplines and developing fields, and now embracing a vast swathe of methodological approaches. This session addresses a range of issues related to fieldwork, ethnography, and the role of a researcher. Okay. The speakers are Dr. Lois Fitch here, from the Royal Northern College of Music. Her research interests are contemporary British music, issues in the notation of new and experimental music, interdisciplinarity, analytical techniques and context. Also we've got Dr. Maria Vavarigu from Canterbury Christchurch University from here. Her research interests are in lifelong music learning, music and well-being, intergenerational practices, interactions in music, vernacular performance practices. And lastly but not least, Professor Anna Morecambe from Royal Holloway College, Royal Holloway University of London. Her research interests are music, economy and capitalism, musical cultures in Tibet, dance and song in Bollywood films, obviously, Bollywood films, India and South Asia. Please welcome our guests. Thank you. So I think Lewis is going to go first. We'll take questions at the end, if that's okay. We'll let everyone, as I say, we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, just say if you can't hear anything, although this appears to be working. I was asked to talk about my experience working with living composers, my response to which initially was, well, it's better than working with dead ones. And then I thought about my experiences over the last 5 or so years. In 2013 I published my first book, which was on the composer Brian Ferneyhough, who is quite a controversial character, if any of you have come across his music or his writings. He's now in his early 70s, and I wrote the first monograph in English on this composer. It was an interesting experience, quite eye-opening in terms of the interactions and the communities it brought me into contact with. I must say as well, just to contextualise this, that I used to work at Durham University and had first met Ferneyhough there when I was an undergraduate. He came along to do a talk on a new piece which was then premiered. And my research at that time was quite conventional. Although I had access to the composer in that sense, I tended to take quite a philosophical perspective on what he was doing, mainly because he himself talks an awful lot about philosophy when contextualising his compositional activity. But in 2008 I moved to the Royal Northern, where I am still, and it's really opened my eyes to different ways of researching. For a start, it's brought me into contact with different communities of researchers, notably performance, obviously, and it's kind of shifted my view an awful lot about how to deal with somebody like Ferneyhough and the issues that studying his music raises. And it's obviously also brought me into contact with a lot of performers, some of whom have performed his music, both from graduate students right up to professionals who visit the college. And so it's really become a proper community in that sense that I've managed to engage with. So including Ferneyhough and a couple of other composers, I've come into contact with a number of performers who have either commissioned work from him or performed work of his recently. Radio producers, so I've been on Here and Now a couple of times talking about Ferneyhogh's music. There's a huge community of new music fans, a sort of underground community. The Radio 3 message boards are incredibly live with discussion. It's a social space which we don't tend to think about. We think about Facebook, we think about Twitter, we think about other kinds of academic communities such as this in a conference, but actually there are, depending on the specialism that you engage with, there are often different communities that you can explore as well, and one of which for me certainly has been the Radio 3 message boards. It's where I've had the best feedback, I would say, about my research, and it's also a community of people who are both knowledgeable and just frankly interested in the repertoire, and so gauging those different perspectives. You know, it's not a purely academic community, it's not purely a community of practitioners, it's people who may have a passing interest in new music or in Ferneyhough in particular, and I found that really instructive. I've worked quite a lot at the Paul-Sacher Stiftung, the archive in Basel, that holds a lot of materials, sketch materials, for example, on early pieces. of composers, living composers, Fernie Ho being one of them. And I've also worked quite a lot when Paul Archbold was in charge of the Institute for Musical Research, because his interest was also in contemporary music. So I worked on a couple of documentaries that he made with Fernie Ho and performers for screening on obscure TV channels. So I thought about what I was going to say. First I thought, let's start with a positive. Let's start with the rewards of working with a living composer. I must say, just to qualify this, that when I make comments about Fernie Ho, he is notoriously difficult, I would say, both to engage with in terms of the level at which he pitches his thought. He writes in a deliberately obfuscatory way, I would say, to make it quite difficult for you to access the essence of what he's talking about in relation to his music. That's both a self-protective thing and just irritating, if I'm going to be honest about it. He's also quite mercurial as a character. I've found him at times very accommodating, very open and approachable. At other times, I gave a talk once at Durham when I was still a postgraduate student, and he walked off the stage halfway through, apparently annoyed by something I'd said. So I've seen kind of both sides of that. I would say that the most rewarding thing about working with living composers and also the performers that engage with that music is the capacity to document the creative process, to see it from its inception right through to performance and to reception. That's something which, having done some archival research in the past on other composers, you know, you can see sketch materials, sketchbooks and things in archives, but actually to be able to have access to a living composer, to actually see things, and even to have correspondence with them and know that there's a piece in the making, but that hasn't even been started yet, but that these are the ideas that are forming around it. It's quite an interesting perspective to have, and it's one that's also been made more interesting by seeing performers grappling with this material anew. There's a lot of pieces Fernie Ho wrote in the 70s and 80s which are becoming more and more performed, even by, as I mentioned before, some of our own graduate students at the college. But there are equally pieces that are being written right now that haven't yet received a performance, and it's interesting to talk to the performers that are actually going to be taking those works on. So variously, I've been in touch with the Arditi String Quartet, for example, who have played all of Fernie Ho's quartets. So their perspective is really interesting because it's a new piece that he will give them, most recently a sixth quartet, and it has its own particular challenges. At the same time, they've been playing his quartets for 30 years, so they've developed a particular way of approaching the material. On the other hand, there are new instrumentalists, new young performers who are not that long out from music college, who he is writing for, and it's interesting to watch them coming to terms with these pieces that take probably 6 to 9 months to learn, and all the issues attendant on that, really. It's really opened my eyes to the extent to which performance and preparing performance and engaging with composers and this creative process is research, and how little we actually, in traditional musicological terms, perhaps think about that creative process, what lies behind the score. But also on the other side of it, there's an increasing tendency towards researching what's called genetic criticism, so the idea of researching sketchbooks and things of historical composers as well as living ones to document and ascertain what the creative process is. But most interestingly for me, where there is very little work, is in the creative process once the performer receives the score, what the performer then does with that. And for anyone who knows anything about Fernie Ho's music, it requires an awful lot of performer input, to the extent that performers routinely renotate material. And so I think there's a whole body of work to be done looking at the annotations that that performers make on scores, and actually asking the question, what is this person actually performing? And so having access to these communities and to watch this process, I've managed to see lots of performers and look at their scores. And I mean, to me, they look very little like how they look when they come off the press. When Fernie Ho's produced them, they've got coloured parts on, big lines through certain bits, additional notes and markings and articulations and instructions, pages stuck together and all blown up into huge sizes. So it's a really interesting thing to look at that side of the coin as well. The drawbacks. These comments are very specific to Fernie Ho himself and a couple of performers. It's probably not terribly politically correct to say, but actually it is true that Fernie Ho as a character being quite difficult tends also, or has tended, to attract performers who are quite idiosyncratic also. And so working with those communities of people can be quite challenging. For one thing, you can struggle to get quite a lot of information out of people, and when you do, what I discovered when writing the book was that I was being told things perhaps about biography by Fernie Ho, which he may well have remembered exactly what he was telling me, but then other sources didn't tend to corroborate always the information that I was being given. Fernie Ho asked to see a draft of the book before it was published, and I wouldn't let him. And that led to some difficulties, partly because he felt he'd given me lots of information. Notably, he'd given me photographs from his youth, he'd given me access to scores that no one else had seen that were in the Sachstiftung that dated from the first 10 years of his compositional career that had never been published. And I'd sort of had access to all of that. And then he didn't want the book to be published without him seeing it, but I managed to kind of fudge my way through that by, I'm afraid, wimping out and promising him that I was going to send it, and then I just never did. And he got so busy and distracted. Thankfully, he's actually quite disorganised despite the appearance of the notation, which actually meant that I got away with that. I remember he came to the RNCM for the book launch, and the only comment he made, somebody asked him, you know, what do you think of the book? At which point I just thought, oh God. And he said, I've read it, and I can confidently say I'll never read it again. And then he sat down, and all my colleagues were up in arms, going, how rude, how rude. And actually, it was one of the biggest compliments I could have had, because it meant it had annoyed me. And that's what I was going to say, really, as my main point, is that the hardest thing to do when you're working with living composers and performers and actually writing about their practice is to maintain a critical distance, because it's very easy to find yourself stuck between, for example, the publisher, who wanted Fernie Ho's authorization for any comments I was repeating, quite rightly, from an ethical standpoint, wanted his authorization for comments I was going to repeat and put into the book. On the other hand, I've got Fernie Ho, who wants right of veto, in effect, over certain elements of what I put in the book. And trying to sort of navigate that to make sure that what actually made it into the text was something that had not been pre-authorized by Fernie Ho or censored by the press, it was quite a fine line to tread, and I think that's probably, for me, the most well, the biggest lesson that I've learned, and I've run out of time, so I'm going to stop there. But if anyone's got any questions, they can ask at the end.
Yes, thank you very much. Can we thank you. We've got questions at the end, so we'll move swiftly on to Dr. Maria Vavarigu.
Yeah, I can good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many people at the student conference. My background is music education, music health, music psychology, and I was telling Vanessa that this kind of conference is not very well known amongst the circles of music educators and psychologists. So before I start talking about my research and the challenges of working with vulnerable people, young children, educators, students, I want a raise of hands of if there's anyone in this field of studies, music psychology, music education, health. Oh, there are quite a lot of people. Great. Okay. Thank you. I will start by giving a couple of examples of the type of research that I have been involved in. And again, I like your example of challenges and benefits from engaging with this particular populations and this type of research. So I think I'll copy you in that. I was involved in a quite big project on the benefits of music on the well-being and the health older people, of healthy older people. And after that, we produced a book called Active Aging with Music. And one of the greatest challenges of this kind of research was that you had to go and meet and interview people about their personal experiences. For me, after having done some research on psychology and analyzing big spreadsheets, just seeing trends of how people behave, that was one of the most important and rewarding things, to actually meet people and ask them about their own personal experiences without having to worry too much about whether this experience is similar to someone else's and whether you can group this response to someone else's response so as to make a statistical graph that will show, oh yes, music is so good for people. And I think one of the things I want to say in today's presentation is just to encourage people to engage in narrative research, autobiographic research, autoethnographic research, because I feel that there is great value in getting individual perspectives on how people experience music, how people engage with others in music, and I think that's one of the greatest, benefits of doing research in music and health psychology education. So one of the biggest things I remember from this project was interviewing around 50 or 60 people in groups or individually about the benefits of music. So there were too many older ladies who were very, very keen on talking to me about their experiences, treating me with tea and cakes and coffee, so I couldn't say no. I could see how, for them, it was one way of talking to others about their life experiences, which I think has a value in itself. But on the other hand, they were very honest about why they engage in music and how beneficial this was for them. And I remember a lady saying, "There's nothing better than playing the ukulele. That's the best kind of medical treatment that you can get." Another lady saying, she was in a rock group, she was in her 70s, and she said, "Maria, it's so exciting. We formed this rock group and we put on leather clothes and we go on stage and we sing. And my daughter is sitting at the front row and she's filming me and taking pictures. And I used to do that for her." So this is the kinds of things that I really enjoyed hearing from these people. And it wasn't prompted, it was very honest and very spontaneous. So that's one of the things I want to underline, how wonderful it is to have interviews, talking to people about their own personal experiences. Of course, then there is this issue of ethics that my colleague raised a little bit. On the one hand, you want to summarize the narrative that people have given you, and you want to be as honest as possible. At the same time, it's important to recognize your bias as a researcher, because when you enter a field, you enter this field with your own experiences, with your own perceptions of what should be happening or shouldn't be happening. And in psychology, education and health, it's very common that we send our transcripts to the participants to seek an opinion and agree whether they like what we said about them or about their experiences. And that's always a very a weak moment, I think, for the researcher, because on the one hand you want to be honest and say what you thought these people were saying. On the other hand, people still have the right to change what they said. So there is something that you, as a researcher, you have to decide whether you want to report the data as you have collected them, and then maybe have a commentary on the changes that people made on what they said during the interview and your interpretation of their interview. And again, that's a great challenge, I think, in social research, but I think it's one worth kind of tackling. Sometimes you have participants agreeing with what you have written about them, and sometimes you can see that their comments are just about beautifying what they have already said, when actually their comments were very poignant, or they were criticizing other people. Another thing that I'm interested in, apart from older people's musical experiences and what they think the benefits of engaging in music are, is how musicians, professional musicians or music students, engage in music making in a more spontaneous and creative way. So my other project is called Playing by Ear, and I was working with Professor Lucy Green, who has done quite a lot of research on how popular musicians learn. I wanted to see how music students in our department, most of them are classically trained, how do they return to playing by ear when they are at university? Because we probably all have done it as children, we all enjoyed it until the moment a music teacher told us, no, don't play by ear anymore, you have to read the score, because if you don't read the score, you're not going to be a good musician. So I had quite a lot of hesitation from the students at the beginning, asking them just to copy music by ear from recordings in a group and trying to improvise and try to create their own renditions of the music. But I thought that was again one of the most wonderful projects I was involved in, because I thought I gave a lot of freedom to the students, work with their own groups, giving them some very vague guidelines on what they had to do. And I could see that once you pass the authority on to the music participants or the project participants, then the findings that you get from the project are more interesting than the ones that you would have probably gotten if you had planned everything to the letter. So in this research that I did, I was collecting the diaries of the students after each playing by ear session over 5 weeks. And I had only one question: how did you go about copying music by ear in a group? And it was very interesting because I was comparing the responses from the same people in the same group, from the different people, sorry, in the same group. And what I thought fascinating is that although everybody was supposed to be doing the same thing, listening to the music, copying by ear and trying to play with others, they all took a very different and very individual take on playing by ear and improvising. And I thought that was wonderful. That was really wonderful. It was much better than giving people a questionnaire at the end and saying, what did you think about blah, 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 blah. Because essentially everyone was talking about the same kind of experience, but experiencing differently and viewing it through their own eyes. So again, going back to my first point about the benefits of engaging in narrative research, ethnographic research, autoethnographic research, there's great value in hearing about personal experiences. And now I think the scientific, let's say, community recognizes that. There are quite a lot of studies in psychology and education that they don't focus too much on the statistics and the graphs, and they always try to get individual narratives of people about what it is that the studies focusing on. So just to conclude what I want to say today, apart from the challenge of ethics and the benefit of hearing people's individual experiences and how valuable that is, I want to kind of think about why that would be interesting for someone else to read. So for me as a researcher, it's very interesting to read, to talk to people and tell me about their own experiences of music, but I was thinking, why would someone be interested in reading my work? So, and I leave it with you. That's a question that I want all of you to think about when you write your thesis or where you present your work in front of an audience. Why this kind of research might be of interest to other people apart from you, because as researchers sometimes we're a little bit selfish. We focus on what we like, but we forget why this might be of relevance to others, why this might be of interest to others. And there's always a good reason. So I just want to invite you to think of this good reason why your interesting research might be of interest and relevance to an audience.
Thank you, Dr. Maria Bahari. Okay, last but not least, we have Professor Anna Morgan from Royal Holloway University of London. And thank you very much, so please.
Thanks for having me here. Okay, I'm just going to talk generally about fieldwork ethnography. I've done work in India and Tibet, and it actually grew out, I hadn't planned that. I'd left school and I'd gone on a gap year to India, I was teaching English to Tibetan performers, just happened to be at the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts in North India, Exile Tibetan, so it completely changed the course of my life. I was going to be coming back and studying English literature, and I left that, came to SOAS, and it all happened unexpectedly, and actually that's the first point about field work, is tend to happen unexpectedly, by coincidence. So how do you plan for field work? And the answer is you do plan, you have to plan, you have to go in with some kind of a working plan, or ideally some kind of contacts, but things happen very differently. That's always been my experience. So a nice quote from Bruno Nettle says, in fieldwork there's less standardization than in other activities of the research process. It is more art than science. It's the part that cannot really be taught, which each must learn on his own, finding ways of mediating between his or her personality with its strengths and weaknesses, confidence and timidity, and the individuals whose shared beliefs he will learn and interpret. He or she, sorry, Bruno Nettle was writing in 1983. Doing fieldwork, it's all about human relationships, and sort of managing or negotiating. And I think to do fieldwork, ideally you should be very fascinated by people and engaging with people and listening to people, observing them. If you're one of these people who just sort of always is sort of noticing what's going on. That's the sort of thing, if you like doing that, you know, you'd love field work. So another author in the book Shadows in the Field, I mean, that's absolutely wonderful, just, you know, one volume to look at in terms of ethnographic field work. Nicole Beaudry talks about field work as human research methodology, and talks about the challenge of human relations in the field. So, you know, humans can be very challenging. You know, you want something, or you think you've set something up and then they don't turn up, or then they're busy, or then they can be, maybe they're a bit funny with you, or, you know, any number of things can be very, very unexpected. So fieldwork generally involves a lot of frustration. And of course there are different fieldwork sites, and my fieldwork has been on the, if you like, traditional model of going, you know, a British and white person going out to, you know, far-flung places in Asia and doing field work there. But a lot of field work is now, you know, quote-unquote, at home in some way. But there are still these challenges of how things go and dealing with people. But relationships, I mean, in my PhD research was working on the Hindi film industry. So I was, you know, a fairly young sort of woman, you know, in the Bollywood film industry, meeting people who are actually far more, you know, powerful, rich, important than me. So, which is not the way that, you know, this classic texts of ethnography are written around. And of course I had sort of privilege and power, but it wasn't something I was very aware of, put it like that. So for me it was just sort of trying desperately to get interviews and sort of, and get people to talk. I mean, doing interviews is about getting people to talk and sort of, I mean, one of the best pieces of advice one of my PhD supervisors gave me before going to the film industry was just remember, no flattery is ever too much. And it's true. But other field sites I've been in have been very different. So, for example, after that I did some research in Tibet. I had about a year's field work there, and I had this lovely project planned. It all looked so good on paper. It got funded. It was about the interaction of music and dance in Tibet, because in Tibet all dances are sung to. So you have these dance songs, sort of circle dances, which I find completely fascinating. But I got there and I just sort of could hardly find any of them, or they only happened at New Year, and then you can only be in one place at New Year, or maybe two. It's a huge, you know, terrain, Tibet. So it was very impractical, and I planned to go to eastern Tibet, where there are very famous dance songs. But it just sort of didn't happen. I didn't meet people. And then instead I met all these people from northeast Tibet and became very good friends with them. One I met by coincidence, somebody I'd met earlier travelling, who then knew the person who was a tour guide, and then he knew this girl who was a singer in a nightclub. And so I met her and we hit it off and became absolute inseparable best friends. So I ended up seeing a lot of contemporary Tibet, contemporary performance, urban spaces, and also the music industry through her eyes. And that's the way a lot of my fieldwork has happened. Not that I sort of set out to do it like that, but, or I was sort of cynically finding people to be friends with to sort of, you know, kind of get their experience. But it just happened, and that's also the beauty of it. So, you know, it didn't feel like work. It was just absolutely wonderful. We, you know, hung out and sort of went everywhere together. Then there was someone from her village who played this instrument. I was interested in learning this particular genre, so we became friends as well. And these two were from the same village, but very. She was very sort of upwardly mobile, very able to sort of capture the modern world. He was in terms of the village, a much better singer, but much less educated. And so through the two of them, I saw all sorts of things about class and opportunity and mobility in Tibet. So it was not planned. But those relationships, I mean, they're still close friends. I have many other very close friends from fieldwork. And that's really what, for me, really starts to open things up, and that's the beauty of it. It also brings up other questions of, you know, ethics and responsibility. Do you then just sort of leave and forget your friends, or, you know, or if you need to go back in future, you know, how many people can you see if you're doing field work in many different sites in Asia, you know? It becomes quite difficult to visit all these people you're very attached to, but then if you don't, people obviously get annoyed with you and think, you know. And you do get some ethnomusicologists who really stick to one place, and partly it's because of the really deep attachments they have to people. So it's a very sort of, yeah, it's a sort of, it's through human relationships. Just seeing how much time we've been talking for. Okay, I'll say something else, that the doing fieldwork was, you know, there's been a lot of theorising of doing fieldwork in terms of insiders and outsiders. That's that sort of classic, you know, outsider, you know, white man goes to sort of, you know, small tribe in, you know, other side of the world. And obviously, you know, that's been critiqued, especially if we have fieldwork at home. It's a useful dynamic, but what I find much more useful is to look at fieldwork from the experience point of view, and rather than saying that you are the positive model, that you're almost like some sort of piece of scientific equipment, you know, like the camera which just sits there and in its fixed point, and it captures and it observes what's going on. You're not a fixed point. The crucial thing is that you're not a fixed point, and you change throughout the fieldwork. You change the experiences and those relationships with people in the field, whether it's at home or, you know, in a far-flung place. They transform you. So this, you know, your experience and then your subjects, I never like that term, you know, usually it's just friends or people you meet, but the people you meet in the field, they're also changed through contact with you. So Timothy Rice has written about this, theorised it, calling it Phenomenological Hermeneutics, and talking about these arcs of experience which change you, your experience, who you are, because who you are is crucial in the field. You know, who you. I mean, I was a bit older than that friend of mine in Tibet, but if I'd been, I don't know, 20 years older, 30 years older, and not, you know, we might not have hit it off in the same way. We probably wouldn't. She wouldn't have opened up to me in the same way. Or if I'd been a man, you know, so on and so forth. So there's all sorts of things which guide who will open up to you. It's of course your skill in getting people to open up and being genuinely interested in them, but there are all sorts of things that situate you. So you have to be quite aware of yourself. You also have to be very patient, often extremely patient, and, you know, and very polite, because there are lots of more formal situations. I mean, I remember having an interview with a sort of important older man in the Indian film industry who was telling me all this absurdly basic stuff about Indian film music, sort of on and on and on, and I only had a certain amount left on my cassette tape, and so I just sort of quietly sort of leaned over and pressed pause without him noticing, and then managed to start it up again when he'd gotten something more interesting. But yeah, it can be a politeness test. And I think it can get hot in that point of view if as you get older. Maybe maybe should get more polite as an author. But I think as a younger person, you're more used to having to be sort of reverent or obedient, or especially talking to people who are older, you're patient. Or but as you get older, it can be that you're also more often in charge of situations. So it does, you know, how old you are. In my own experience of doing fieldwork for, I know, 25 odd years, so I didn't know it was that I was doing when I was first doing it. I certainly see my positionality changing, and things I could get away with before in the field I can't. For example, situations where people were very kind and patient to me as a sort of like oh, this sort of young girl who's come so far, and you know, we'll help her. You know, it doesn't sort of wash that way anymore. So I think briefly, just to wrap up, the issue of ethics, it's always there with fieldwork. There is no fieldwork, you know, human relations without questions of ethics and questions of power. Even if you're not in a powerful position in the field, you might have a very hard time in that situation there. You might not be in a powerful position at all, but you get to write about it. So all these questions we've discussed already a bit. Do you show draft to people? Well, that's difficult if they don't really read or are not sort of, you know, particularly formally educated. I tend to discuss stuff, discuss my ideas with people extensively, not in formal academic terms. And if they disagree, I'd want to represent that. But it is an act of representing. This is constructing knowledge, and that's a form of power. So, and what do you get out of it? You know, you get your PhD, you might get a job, or you get your book done, you might get promoted, so on and so forth. And I never saw it like that when I was doing it way back, but now I'm more in the sort of the academic career. I do see that in a different way. So, you know, what do you get? What do they get? Questions of giving back have been very important, but that's also a responsibility, giving back. If they're very poor people, if you give lots to one person and not others, that creates other problems. So the whole thing is very messy, very, very complex, but also fascinating and really, really wonderful. There's, you know, forms of, you know, ways you can empower people. You can make people think. You can shake people out of sort of patterns of thought, which are all about power as well. So it's worth doing, but it's very complex.
Thank you very much, panel. Well, thank you very much to our three speakers now. Okay, right, I'm sure we've all got lots of questions. Please, let's open the floor up, please. Thank you. Would you?
Just, I mean, kind of picking up off the... Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, well... just kind of starting off from that last point of also kind of the ethics. The thing I think I've seen myself in a lot of fieldwork is the moments of where does it become too personal to write about more. I mean, in sort of my field, it was very much about kind of very young people who are trying to learn this art form, and then they're being criticized by their teachers, and you're there witnessing that. And in a way that says a lot about the art form you're studying, but then it's also obviously very painful experience for the people concerned. So just kind of what your thoughts on that particular issue are, I'd be very curious to hear.
I was thinking one of the points I would have made if I'd had a bit more time probably would have been to say, would I have written a very different book if Fernie Ho was no longer alive? And the answer to that is yes, because in the course of the research I found things out which, had they been published, would have caused a great many more people than him personal difficulty. And while he is living, and his wife, that is not something that I felt it was worth doing. So I suppose you have to weigh up what contributes to your research and to a representation of somebody, and that is reasonable to put out there in the public domain, and then also remembering that there are things that don't actually add anything particularly at the time to an argument. And that in many ways when you're dealing with people who are living whatever community they're from, it's as you were saying, you know, you do have to give something back, and you also have to remember, you know, you might want to work with these people again, and so you have to judge that very carefully. But it's one of the biggest things when you're working with living communities, that you have to be aware that those people will encounter your research, they will see that, and it's putting things out there that you have to be very responsible about it.
Okay. Yeah, I think it is it's very difficult. I mean, I think people have different attitudes. Some people, I mean, you read some ethnographies and you think, gosh, you know, like, did all that really need to go in? Or, I think people have different attitudes. It depends the kind of person you are. I mean, I would never want to write about, I mean, I think there's some kind of ethnographic writing which is very sort of novelistic. And can be beautiful to read, very engaging to read, but sometimes it writes about people and they're quite sort of small or amusing or little anecdotes, and I feel quite uncomfortable with that sort of thing. So I guess with people I know, if they know I'm doing research and if we're discussing stuff I might well write it. Sometimes people sort of say, please do write that. I guess you can always ask people, how would you feel if I wrote that? And you can always disguise things, you know. I mean, I mean, I don't generally name people, or I give full, you know, disguised names. I give pseudonyms. But I mean, you can ask people if you're really concerned about that, because you could say it'd be nice for people to understand it, a sort of difficult experience you go through. But you know, I could disguise it a bit, or you can sort of mix, you know, blend two people, so it's not so that sort of thing.
Just a final comment on that. I thought you were talking about you as a researcher experiencing what other people are experiencing, something like that. So that I just thought of, for example, how Indian or Chinese or I don't know, Japanese musicians experience apprenticeship in music, when you have the master telling you you're rubbish, you're not doing it right, do it like me, and then you copy the same phrase 50 times for I don't know how many hours, and then you feel that you want to tell them, actually that's not a good way of teaching, you should change your teaching style. But then the point is, do you have the right to do that? Because your research was to go there and observe what was happening. I would interfere, or I would talk about something that I observed if I could see something like an abuse, or like child abuse, or any kind of abuse of power. Then I would talk about it to people that I thought would be that have an authority in the field, and maybe encourage them to observe it themselves. But other than that, if your research is about a specific thing and you go and observe that, I think that's part and parcel of what you're researching, and I wouldn't interfere.
Thank you very much. Yes. Any more questions? I know that you had your hand up next, did you see? Anybody else? For a minute? Okay, we'll go with that for a minute. Thank you.
I was just wondering what sort of role you see yourself in the field. Like, is your role, okay, I'm a researcher gaining some sense of reality of what's going on, or is your role maybe someone who is an educator that is doing research? You know, is there like multiple roles, or is it like I am a researcher, and what's the output that you see as the primary output of that role?
I don't think that one works.
Oh.
This one, the right battery's got that.
Otherwise,
Who would like to go
there was a
first?
little one. I'm happy to.
Do you want to go first? Go on.
That's an interesting question. I think one has multiple. I mean, one always has multiple roles. I think it switches. I mean, sometimes I'm very clear that I'm a researcher. I'm here to do my, you know, I've got to sort of meet certain people and get the job done. But at the same time, I am sort of being me. I'm just sort of living. I'm being myself, and I'm meeting people. I'm enjoying talking to them. I'm making friendships. So it is just sort of, you know, part of my lived life. It's not all like, here I am doing research. You know, that is just what I'm doing here. In terms of being an educator, I've never been in that situation, but I've been in a situation with a lot of people who are, you know, they're having all sorts of problems. You know, you get to know them. It might be often related to music. You know, they're trying to make an album, or get work or whatever it is, and it feels very natural to want to try and brainstorm with them. I guess that's the kind of person I am, and to try and help in any way I can. That feels very natural to do, and also just to give people information. There's stuff that I might have learned from talking to someone else, or I might know anyway, which I think it's good to let people know. So in a way, that is, I wouldn't see myself as an educator as in such a formal way, but to certainly try and help and inform and use the resources I'm lucky enough to have to do that.
Okay. Sometimes I feel it depends on the type of research that you're involved in, because sometimes you're a participant as well. So you kind of experience what other people experience in your own way. So in that sense, I feel that I have the same rights as the people with me if I make music with them and I am observing what they're doing. But sometimes I feel that if my role is to just observe, and it all depends on, I think for me, what my research question is, what it is that I want to tell other people, and what it is I think that might have relevance to people reading my work. If it's a personal thing and I want to experience what it's like making music with children with disabilities, for example, then I think I would interfere, not interfere, but I would consider myself a participant in the process, and I might ask the teacher, why do we do it like this, or something like that. But I try to interfere as less as possible when my role is just there to observe and monitor what's happening.
Yeah, I guess I would say obviously my research is in quite a different context, and one thing that I was asked when I was given the book contract was to absolutely make it not an academic book. So it was not to be purely for academics and to sort of, forgive me, talk in Fernie-Hoese, if you like. But to actually make it accessible, and that's one of the things that I really tried to do, was to make it approachable for people who may just come across this stuff or have a passing interest in new music that would help them break down some of the barriers around Fernie-Hoese music, arguably. And I tried to do that quite right from the very start in the way that I presented the material. And that was really the approach that I took in engaging with source materials and all sorts of things. So I didn't see myself as anything other than a musician, really, and trying to be a musician, think about how I heard the stuff, think about how my encounter with the notation informed my relationship to the music. So I might not perform Fernie-Ho and I might not be a composer, but I definitely didn't want to take a kind of traditional analytical perspective and speak to an already established community of musicians who might have interest in those kinds of techniques, but to just really listen to the stuff and to know that it was controversial and to kind of take that on and run with it, as opposed to try and overcome it somehow. It was quite nice working on something that is a bit controversial and therefore just being able to explore that, really.
Actually, I'd just like to add, I mean, in ethnographic fieldwork, you'd never be able to just be an observer. I think it's a bit different from the kind of work you're doing, which is a bit more on the science. You have a slightly more controlled environment, whereas with ethnographic fieldwork, the idea is actually to sort of embrace not just being an observer and to be a participant. And there's lots of work on participant observation. In music, you typically start learning a musical instrument or whatever, or you go and help someone with their cooking and you chat to them in that way. So the emphasis is you're not objective. The powerful thing is your subjectivity and your involvement and your participation.
Thank you. Cheers. We've got time for probably one or maybe one more question.
From there somewhere.
Who was?
Yeah.
Just there. Okay, right. There you go.
I'm fascinated by what we've all been saying. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what we think the motivation of the people you work with is. So you've said why you want to do it. Why do you think they agree to do it? What do they want out of it when they agree to meet you or let you join them?
Okay. I think in my experience, people have just been very nice. Often, you're talking about them and their lives and music, and people are often very happy to talk about that. A lot of people are very happy to contribute to research. So, you're writing a book, or it's research, or that's a good thing. The sense that is a good thing. Sometimes it's just that somebody, in the Indian film industry, people would never have just met me. It's because I had a sort of contact via somebody else who said, would you meet this person? So they were meeting me because of that. But generally they were, they didn't look totally bored in the conversations, I felt, hopefully rightly. And if you're talking about them or what they're interested in, people are often interested to talk. And some people want their stories told. Working with marginal communities, which I was in my most recent project in India, transgender or feminine, female, men, boys who are female, feminine. For them, as a marginal community, they're very ready to speak out and tell you their story. If you're happy to listen and you're really genuinely interested and respect them and love what they do, they're more than happy to speak. So there's absolutely no problem getting them to talk at all. Other people can be more secretive. Take a while to trust you. You need the contacts. But often people, once you sort of break through that, people are happy to contribute to a research project, and tell their stories, and often very generously.
Yeah, I find undeniably in the kind of research I do, there is a posterity thing. So there's an element, certainly for Fernyhough, where someone's written a book on his music and a little biography, and it's important to him that is documented, which is why I think he let me see materials that had been embargoed up to that point. I think turning 70 for him was a big thing, and so he saw it as coincidental that the book was being written around the same time. I think for performers, especially in the kind of new music that I work with, a performance comes out of many, many months of hard work, and quite often quite isolated work, I think, especially for solo performers. Many report that it takes, not exclusively, but that it takes 9 months or so to get a piece concert ready. And a lot of them want that to be reflected. They want people to understand what goes into it. And it's like I was saying about the creative process, that a lot of this music is problematized for the performer to the extent that that process is just as creative and just as long in the making as the composition itself. And to that extent, they want that out there. They want people to know about that experience. And it's also a case that people enjoy talking about their practice and what they're doing. It's like you were saying, they're quite happy to be involved in research and to be able to talk. And one of the nicest things is when ideas you have and suggestions you make then become something they take on board. So once or twice performers in particular have worked with me in different perspectives and looking at things in new ways, and that's rewarding, I hope, they say so, for them as well as for me. So that's a really nice reciprocal thing that comes out of it.
Yeah, I think my colleagues have answered as well.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Please, can we show our appreciation, please, for Dr. Dr. William and Tessa. Thank you very much for